Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, welcome to episode 66 of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast.
66? That's amazing.
It is. My name is Sam Kemp, and I am the host, and I'm joined as always by Richard Blackaby, for whom the podcast is named. Richard, it's always good to see you.
Well, thanks.
Well, today we're discussing a very important issue, and one that I think every leader has to deal with at some point in some way. It comes in all shapes and sizes. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to dive into today?
Yeah, Sam, this is a more difficult one, but it's about discouragement. And certainly leaders face it, or they have to battle it, because not everything goes the leader's way. And I think we're seeing, especially in these days, that there's tremendous pressure on leaders to be able to turn things around, to make a profit, to grow an organization. Everybody's eyes are on the leader to somehow save everything. And so leaders come in with a lot of fanfare and expectations and promises, and then a lot of times things don't turn out the way that they hoped it would.
Yeah, and they get a lot of blame if it doesn't.
Yeah, and so I've, when it comes to pastors, I've met with many who will go for dinner with me at a restaurant or something and just pour their heart out. I've had pastors that for an hour or 2 hours just poured out all the frustrations, and the church had told him one thing, and when they got there, it's totally different, and people aren't supportive, and they're critical, and they're killing themselves, and yet people just want to criticize and second guess them. And there's even just been recently a couple of pretty high profile suicides for pastors.
Yeah.
At times that was, there was other factors. There was some mental illness and other things involved with that as well. But it just shows you just how difficult it can be emotionally to lead sometimes. And so I thought it'd be good for us just to talk about what do you do? And of course, we should probably have a caveat to say, if you are struggling with mental illness, clinical depression, some very real issues, that's going to require, that's more than just discouragement.
Right.
In fact, sometimes life can be great for people like that, but clinical depression can make things look dark anyway. And so that's a different issue, and that requires professional help and intervention, and often medication.
Absolutely.
But I'm talking about just, emotionally healthy people who just struggle with feeling discouraged when things don't go their way.
Right. So we're not going to dive into the mental illness aspect of it, but I think we all get discouraged, and but I think there are unique challenges for leaders. What would you say are some of the main causes? I mean, there's all different kinds of discouragement, but let's just kind of look at a few here. Yeah,
we can't certainly do an exhaustive study here just in this short podcast, but a couple that I would just highlight, maybe three. One is what I would just call disappointment. Leaders always, they should come in with a lot of hope and expectation, but like I said, things don't always work out the way they hope. One is disappointment with results, because ultimately leaders are expected to get results.
Right.
So if you lead a company, you're expected to help have healthy profits, and to have a well-running team, and to develop a healthy culture, and to have good rapport with customers and clients. But sometimes we come in and we may have a plan, we may have a vision, and even a PowerPoint presentation, but then people don't always cooperate the way we thought they would. Or maybe we come in and there's I work with one young CEO, had lots of great ideas, but he came in and started trying to implement them in 2008, just as the economic downturn hit.
Yeah.
And so, no fault of his own, his plan was good. He just didn't have a fortune, a crystal ball to know
just
that
the timing was unfortunate.
So, there could be a 9/11. You may have just started a new expansion, and then your whole, customer just went down in flames in a trade tower, and things happen that you can't count on.
Yeah.
And so, and sometimes we think that we have a good plan, and then it just doesn't pan out. We miscalculated. We didn't see all the factors involved.
Yeah.
And people it just doesn't work out. The numbers don't end up adding up, and that's disappointing as a leader, because you're paid to get results, and month after month goes by and those results aren't being produced.
You want to have something to show for your effort.
And the people will give you a little bit of time, a little bit of patience, but anymore, that's a very short leash. And if there's no results, you'll feel the pressure of that. And the other area of disappointment is with people. People will make promises. At times, maybe you hire someone that is supposed to just solve the problems in your organization. Maybe they're a fundraiser and you expect this person's going to they have a great track record of raising money, and they're going to raise lots of money for your nonprofit. Or maybe they're a great salesperson and boy, they've had record sales and for other companies. And there's just so many different people that you could hire or enlist, recruit, and you place a lot of hopes in them, and sometimes they really come through for you, but not everybody does. There's some people that will grossly underperform, or they just won't follow through on their promises and commitments they made. And that's perhaps even more painful when you trust people and then they let you down. Maybe they turn on you. Maybe they subvert you instead of helping you, and all of a sudden you realize these people I was trusting and I cared about, and they've betrayed me, let me down. I tell you, that's just devastating. And I've known some pastors, people in church work that felt that way. And it's very discouraging when you've invested in people, and you may have really cared for them. You may have given them a lot of breaks and help. And instead of them appreciating all you've done for them, they throw you under the bus. And I'll tell you what, that can discourage even some of the hardiest souls. When that happens. Yeah,
and I think inevitably, if you're dealing with people, which any good leader is, I mean, people are always going to disappoint you, and that's a critical way to look at it. But but people are not perfect, and so you can't base your calculations on people acting perfectly, because you will be disappointed. And that's why I say you really have to watch your expectations. Don't expect too much. I'm not saying you should be a pessimist, but I'm saying don't be so idealistic that you're constantly being disappointed. Try to be realistic. I'm working with imperfect people. We're expecting progress, but I realize that I'm not going to put all my hopes. I'm not going to be starry-eyed thinking that this will just be a silver bullet that will solve everything. There's probably going to be some bumps in the road. You have to kind of guard yourself a little bit so that you're not just constantly disappointed, but you're realistic. You know that some shortcomings will come along the way as well. So disappointment is certainly one of the causes of discouragement. A second one is I just call it weariness, just overwork. When you feel great, when you feel healthy and energetic, you've been sleeping well, you're exercising, you're running 5Ks a couple days a week. Well, you're still going to have to deal with some emotional trauma and stress, but you can just handle it better. Right.
But when you're tired, when you've not been sleeping well, when you're overweight, when your heart rate is racing because you're carrying too much weight or you're not exercising, well, then the same stresses that you might have blown off now weigh heavier. They take a toll. And I know it used to be that I remember I went through a season where my wife now and then she'd catch me sighing, just taking these deep breaths. And I was just tired. And when you're tired, it's just way easier to be discouraged.
Yeah.
You don't have the emotional energy, the physical energy, to be able to just withstand the emotionally draining experiences that you have to face. And when you let your tank get empty, then when all of a sudden you got to kind of step on the gas and plow through a difficult time, there's no gas there to use. And so, but I see a lot of leaders these days running on empty. They've got no emotional reserves, no spiritual reserves. And so when someone disappoints them, when the numbers don't come out like they were anticipated, profits are losses instead of profits. When you're tired, it's just hard to take, and you'll find yourself. I've been there at times where when I was really tired, something happens, it's not even that big of a deal. And it's like, why am I getting so worked up about this?
Yeah.
Why am I so cranky about that? Like I normally would just blow that off. But so
I think that's why airports can be such a volatile place.
yeah, there's a lot of tired, jet lagged people, and having to deal with life. The last cause I would just say is spiritual dryness or spiritual neglect.
Yeah.
When you've been neglecting your walk with God. When I see someone that has a vibrant, growing, dynamic relationship with God, it's hard to get discouraged. It's like my dad used to always say, if you're standing and looking at Christ, the risen Christ, seated upon his throne, ruling the universe, it's pretty hard to be discouraged, no matter what's going on. But if you get your eyes off of Christ, if you get your eyes fixated on the problems, the disappointments, well, then all of a sudden, it doesn't necessarily take all that much before you're feeling discouraged. So again, I know even pastors that are very susceptible to this, where they're dealing with the Bible all the time. They're preaching sermons to other people all the time. They're counseling other people, but they're not necessarily filling their own spiritual tank. They're going to the Bible to get a sermon, not to fill their own personal tank. And so I with your prayer life, with your Bible study, when all of a sudden you find that you're neglecting those areas, well, then it doesn't take much for a disappointment to come along, and the next thing you know, you're knocked right out of the saddle. And so just neglecting your own walk with God is going to make you very vulnerable when you have to face the disappointments that are inevitably going to come.
Right, and as we said, we're just looking at a brief overview of just some of the ways that leaders can be discouraged as they lead, and we're going to look at some solutions to this in just a few minutes. But we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll kind of unpack some of the ways that we can overcome these disappointments and discouragements and dryness in your leadership and your spiritual life.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is November 4th through 6th, and registration is open now. The early bird rate is available until October 1st, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes.
So, Richard, as we said before the break, this isn't exhaustive, but we've looked at a couple of ways, 3 ways that leaders can get discouraged and ways that they can just kind of be attacked. And so now we kind of want to shift and look at the ways that we can perhaps overcome some of those discouragements, some of those pitfalls that leaders might face. So can you walk us through some of the ways that we can guard ourselves against discouragement?
Yeah, and again, of course, this is not exhaustive, but here's a couple things you can do right off the bat. One is take your cares to God. 1 Peter 5:7 says, casting all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. That's a great truth. God cares about you. So take those cares that you've been carrying and toss them on him. And of course, that implies that you've got to do something about it. If you hold on to your worries and concerns, then you have to keep on carrying them. It is a choice you make to say, I'm not going to carry this anymore. And I think that's something that we need to do daily. I mean, daily, you've got to say, what are the burdens, the worries, the stresses, the pressures, the disappointments I'm carrying around with me today? And I just need to go to God and just perhaps symbolically just take those off my shoulders and just toss them, cast them upon him. And he's happy to take them from you. In fact, he looks at you and says, why didn't you give these to me sooner? You've been wearing yourself out. And so I find that there's just a great exercise of just regularly saying, what is it that's draining me right now? God, I just need to put the burden of this on you, so I'm not the one carrying it all the time. So that's one thing. The second thing to do is just get rest. Rest. Physically, spiritually, emotionally, get rest. When God created the world, he worked for 6 days, and then God took the 7th day and made it a Sabbath. He rested. And of course, God didn't need to physically rest, but I think he set a great model to say, even God took time just to stop working, to stop and to cease and just to enjoy what he had done, enjoy what the creation was and was for him. And I just know a lot of leaders that don't rest, they don't stop, especially nowadays with your cell phone. Even on the weekends, you're constantly checking it and searching stuff, and an email came in and someone texted you, and I'll just check this site real fast and see how it's going today. And we find ourselves just on duty 24/7.
Yeah, and I've seen a move with a lot of people to sort of take off-grid time, if you will.
Yeah.
And even if that's a day, even if it's, say, Sunday or Saturday or half a day or a whole day or a whole weekend, even, to say, you know what, I'm putting the phone down.
Yeah.
Maybe in an emergency, pick it up, but you're not checking in all the normal places that you do throughout the week.
Yeah.
Because that can just...
I'll tell you what, that's a hard thing. It's for some people, it's like detoxing off of sugar or something.
Right.
For
it is.
to actually just turn your cell phone off for 24 hours.
Yeah, we know these things are addictive.
Yeah.
And yet, we feel like that we, for whatever reason, things, too much could happen in a weekend, and we just can't put it down. And I'm certainly guilty of that.
I think there's a way. I think it's good to perhaps try to take a true Sabbath where you stop certain things, especially if it's really work-related emails and so on. I just perhaps do sort of like the Jewish people did, and Saturday night until Sunday night, or Friday night to Saturday. But for Christians, you might go Saturday night to Sunday night. Just don't check your email. Just turn it off. If all your loved ones are with you, especially, and you're always worrying what if there's a crisis, but it's amazing. I grew up, raised kids without a cell phone, and they all survived.
People have been living for quite a while without the need to be constantly connected.
So I'd say get some rest. One of my first things, if someone came to me and said, I'm worn out, I'm discouraged, I want to quit, I'd say, you know what? Take the next 2 days off. Go to bed early. Don't stay up late watching TV. Get off of the blue screen, and just rest. Just get a deep soak rest, and then come back, and we'll talk about what you're facing. Third thing is just replenish yourself. When you're discouraged, almost inevitably you're empty. So fill your cup back up. For a lot of people, especially pastors, but also other kinds of leaders, you're giving all the time. You're constantly concerned about other people or concerned about the organization. But you're not doing things that just are caring for yourself. Yeah. And so that may mean just reading a good book. It may mean taking your full vacation, taking your weekends off. It might mean just having a nap. There's as I get older, I kind of had a stretch there where I never napped. I never took like a Sunday afternoon nap. But there's been some times lately where I've just really felt like, I think if I just kind of sat back in my recliner for an hour here and closed my eyes, I'd be able to really be invigorated for the rest of all I've got facing on into the evening. So the other thing is get around friends that make you laugh. Hopefully you've got someone in your life that just has a way of sort of tickling your funny bone. And I've got some people like that in my life that whenever I'm around them, I get silly. I get kind of giddy. And sometimes you got to work to get around those folks. You may not live close. It may take some effort. You may feel like you're too busy to do something so frivolous as just go to like a movie with a friend, or go out for lunch, or just go for a hike, go for a golf game. But do something where you just laugh and you don't worry about the stress and strain of your work responsibilities. That's not just frivolous. I used to think that that's got too much to do. But I realize I don't do nearly as good a work when I'm empty as when my cup's full. Yeah. So if this guy will fill my cup, I actually will do better work. And so it's not a waste of time. It's actually going to make me more productive. And the last thing is just, I say just quiet the voices. There are certain voices we listen to that will discourage us. Maybe it might be a critic. It might just be this kind of negative person that we're around, or someone that just keeps on highlighting all the negative statistics. And there comes a time where you just need to turn those voices off for a while and listen to positive voices, listen to God's voice. But sometimes we get almost entranced. It's almost like we're in front of one of those snakes that is hypnotizing us and looking in our eyes, and we can't break the spell of this negative news cycle. And so we keep watching it, or we watch the news on TV, hour after hour getting discouraged about how bad things are, how bad the economy is, or politics, or whatever else, there just comes a point where you're down, you're empty. You don't need to keep hearing those negative voices. It doesn't mean that you don't face reality, but you don't have to continually just immerse yourself in negativity all the time. Get out of that place. Go find a friend that will make you laugh, and don't just victimize yourself by staying in being just drowned by negative voices. Sometimes you got to get up and just get out and get around positive people and get a different perspective. So those are just a few things. There's many things you can do. But I would say, Sam, if one of our listeners even today is just feeling really discouraged, there are things you can do. I think one of the worst things that can happen is for you to begin to feel helpless, like there's nothing I can do. You always can respond. Like as we saw in Peter, you can cast your cares. Just gather those cares up. It doesn't mean you don't have to still deal with the problem, but you can cast all the worrying and stress and strain onto the arms of Jesus and let him carry it for you. But don't just stay in a place of discouragement, because it wears you out and it robs you of the joy that God wants for you.
Well, Richard, I think this is a great place to end our discussion on this today, and I really appreciate you just showing us a few ways that we can handle the inevitable discouragement that comes. One of the things that we like to do periodically is answer questions from listeners, and we've got a few here that we want to go over. We have a listener, David, who wrote in and has this to say. He mentioned a podcast that we did, Moving People onto God's Agenda, last year. He quotes you saying, leaders never blame followers for not following. And you say good leaders, if they're not inspiring people to follow them, then they need to find a different way to follow. And in his observation, he says that this is actually a bit discouraging, because even when he looks at the life of Christ, even he wasn't able to get everyone to follow him. And there's inevitably people who just aren't going to follow what it is that you're doing, regardless of how many ways you change your leadership. So how would you help someone sort of deal with those
that's a great
tensions?
Those great questions, and that's all true. There's a couple things I push back on with that, though. And one is, it's true, there are some people that are just not going to follow.
Right.
Jesus had a Judas, and Moses ran into 10 spies that were fearful. You don't have to look far to find that even some of the greatest leaders had people that still would not follow them.
Right.
So that's true. But a leader's job is to lead. That's what you do. And I've seen some leaders of organizations, businesses, and churches that were hired to move the organization forward, to address problems, to grow the organization. And the leader, a year or two later, things were just stuck in a quagmire.
Yeah.
The whole organization was not moving. The church was still in decline. Like, I've known pastors who were in churches, and for 10 years under their leadership, there was steady decline, less and less attendance, 10 years in a row. Now, those leaders can come to you and say, well, my people just don't want to reach out. My people don't want to grow. They just, I've preached, I've prayed, but they just don't want to change. Well, when someone tells me that, I want to say, well, you were hired not to make excuses. You were hired not to just see if people might want to move. You were hired to move these people, to grow this organization. And you had 10 years, and it's not grown. So at that point, you either need to don't keep doing the same thing. Don't keep leading the same way and then say, hey, I've done all I can. It's their fault. No, if year after year you're not getting results, you don't keep doing the same thing. You don't blame the people. You either change what you're doing and find a different way. You say, it's up to me. I'm the leader. I'm not waiting for the followers to come up and say, oh, I'm so sorry. If you would just do this, we'd be happy to follow you. No, the leader is the one who's always taking the initiative to say, what is it going to take to get these guys moving? So you either find what it takes or you get out of the way. You move and get out of the way. I literally have known pastors, and I know especially focused on churches, but it happens in business as well. I've known pastors that came to a church that was growing before they got there. And then they came, and all of a sudden it's declining, and there's discouragement. People are leaving. but the pastor blames the people. Well, they're just not spiritual. And you want to say, well, they sure seem spiritual under the previous guy. They were knocking it out of the park under him.
Mm-hmm.
Did they just all of a sudden not become spiritual anymore? Did they all of a sudden just become rebellious? Or could it be that you're leading in a way that they're not responding to? And I've known leaders who just stayed there year after year after year until the church was in ruins. And they didn't even have the integrity just to say, well, clearly I'm not the match for these people. My leadership style is not working for these people. I need to get out of the way. And that's why I push back on that, just to say it's just an abdication of leadership when things are going poorly around you to blame the people and say, well, I did my best. The people just didn't want to follow. They wouldn't. Can you imagine someone coaching a professional sports team and 10 years in a row ending in last place in the entire league? But then saying, it's not my fault. I've done the best I could. The team just doesn't want to respond to my leadership.
Well, I mean, that could be said of Buffalo.
Now, I was afraid you might go there. That Buffalo's actually had 4 coaches in about the last 6 years. They're
trying.
They're not tolerating that, And it's funny because, I mean, the last coach they fired, I really liked him. And I liked a lot of what he said, but he was not getting the results. And the team basically said, we're not hiring you to be a nice person. We're not hiring you to do the best you can. We are hiring you to get results, like get in the playoffs, like win games. And if you can't do that, you can't just blame. Now, certainly the players have responsibility for why the team's not doing well. But ultimately, it's the leader that's going to be held accountable.
And I would say, to his point, there will always be the outliers,
right?
They won't.
And that's why I would sort of distinguish. Now, what I've portrayed here is when an entire organization is in trouble, where the church is in perpetual decline, or this organization keeps losing money, keeps losing clients, and no matter what you do, things don't turn around. And in that case, I would definitely say, then the leader needs to go, or the leader needs a huge overhaul. But leaders don't just blame the organization and say it's all their fault. But there are individuals sometimes that will not respond. Now, you may have turned. Certainly, this happens in professional sports where perhaps the team is doing pretty well, but you've got this one player that's not responding. They're not following the system. They're not giving full effort, and they're a distraction to the team. At that point, I would say, you as a leader, you try to find what will motivate them. You try to find what can you tap into that inspires them and helps them and equips them. You certainly don't just give up right away on them. But and I would say, even this person with the question mentioned Jesus. Of course, he had a Judas that did not follow him. But you also notice Jesus never gave up on him. Right to the very Last Supper, Jesus is washing his feet. He is saying in front of all the disciples, I know which one of you is going to betray me. I mean, he's doing everything he can to give Judas the opportunity not to betray him. Even when he sees him in the garden, he's basically still loving him. And Judas is kissing him and identifying him to the others. And Jesus is still trying to be kind to Judas. And even on the cross, he's being blasphemed by both thieves on either side of him. But by the end of that experience, he's already converted one. Here he is, his dying breath, and he's still not giving up on a murderer who was blaspheming him earlier in the evening.
Yeah.
And so Jesus doesn't give it. I think it's faulty to say, don't use Jesus simply as an example of someone who failed. He didn't give up. He kept on trying, and in some cases, right near the very end of his life, he's still having some success turning people to the place that they need to be. So that's what a leader does. He's not going to have a 100% success rate with individuals, but he's also going to not give up, and he's going to keep trying. And and in some cases, he's going to finally turn some people around where they actually become productive and positive. So I know that that's putting some extra pressure on leaders. But I think that's where it belongs. I think should be extra pressure on leaders.
Yeah.
It's a noble calling to lead, and we just have far too many people, particularly in politics today, who never solve problems, who never address issues, but they want us to keep electing them. And they keep wanting to blame other people for why they haven't solved the problem. And I would just say, that's not leadership. That's politics. It's not leadership. Leaders are held accountable. They're expected to get results, and they don't blame other people when they don't get those results. They do what it takes to get people to turn around. And if it's just an individual, sometimes you have to ultimately fire that individual and get a different individual. But for the sake of the organization, leaders do whatever it takes to ultimately get the organization moving to where it ought to be. So a lot to be said there, but I'm not letting leaders off the hook.
Yep.
Ultimately, followers certainly have their own responsibility, but at the end of the day, it's the leader who's responsible to get people moving and get organizations moving. And when you start blaming other people for why you're not successful as a leader, you're not a leader.
All right. I think we'll leave it there. Again, if you would like to submit questions, send those to us, podcast@blackaby.org. And until next time. Would also just like to say thank you for listening. We'd love you to share this with your friends. You can leave us a rating wherever you listen to your podcast. Leave us a 5-star rating. Leave us a review. We appreciate it. And thank you so much for listening.